folks, thanks for joining us today. About a month ago, I actually was at a meeting, and the keynote speaker was a gentleman by the name of Clark Burbidge, and he gave the most incredible talk. And when he was finished, I immediately rushed up to the front, grabbed him, and said, "Hey, let me introduce myself. I want you on my show." And he was kind enough to say yes. And so, Clark, welcome to the show.
That's great to be with you, Doug.
Well, I really appreciate the fact you're willing to be on the show. And again, the talk that you gave was just amazing. And as I've done a little bit more research, and as you and I have chatted a little bit, you are an author of what, 2 award-winning series?
Yes, 2 different trilogies for young adults and youth. And then of course, my last 8 books have all been awarded gold medals as the top book in the world in their category the year they came out.
Wow, that's cool. So what are the names of the 2 series?
The first series for 7 to 15-year-olds, that's the target market, but anybody can read it and enjoy it, is called Giants in the Land. And that's a mythology fantasy series. The second series is for teens and young adults. It's a paranormal and time travel series, and it's called Star Passage.
Okay, so how on earth did you become an author? Because I know that wasn't your life. Well, maybe it was your life ambition, but it certainly wasn't how you've been surviving over the years.
Well, anybody who grows up with a number of children learns how to tell stories, and I've always loved telling stories, and I like to do it on the spur of the moment. We wouldn't know where we're going as they'd lay in their beds and the thing would develop. And so I've always enjoyed doing that. I spent my career as an investment banker and a chief financial officer. And you have to be able to write and communicate. People don't think that that's a creative profession. They think it's kind of a troglodyte kind of profession, somewhere with the Neanderthals.
Right.
But if you're not creative and you can't paint a picture in a very brief time for those who are adult ADD, then you can't survive. And so I learned how to do that along the way. And one thing that happens with CFOs is you bring your company to a point where it's ready for the next step, either an exit or new capital comes in, or you get purchased by somebody, and then you're out of a job. The 2 things they don't need are 2 chief executives and 2 chief financial officers.
Yes.
And so one of you is going. And so that happens. You get used to it. And in between gigs, you have some time. And back in 2010, I was in between my chief financial officer jobs. And I thought, well, it's no fun networking 24/7. That gets old. I still have to do it. But how about this bucket list? And on my bucket list were a number of ideas that I had about books. And so I did my first book and put it out there, not knowing anything. I called lots of people and talked to them and did the kind of research I was used to doing, but really had no background. And it's kind of a long story, but I got fortunate with a publisher that first rejected me, and my wife said I didn't know what to do. I was sitting there at the computer staring at the rejection notice, and she said, "Well, why don't you write them a letter? It sounds like they didn't even read what you sent them." And she said, "What can you do? Get rejected twice? This is a double rejection." I said, "Yeah, I'll send him an email," and I did. And I was nice and tactful, but I said, "You know what? I'd like to learn from this process. I'm very new. How about just giving me a little insight on what I did wrong, how I can do it better? And by the way, it doesn't even feel in your letter like you read it." And I got one of these wonderful emails back that said, basically it said, "Well, you called our bluff. Our reader didn't actually read it, didn't have time, and so we just thought we'd reject you." And I said, "Well, look, would you do me a favor? Just assign some lower second assistant to nobody to read it so I can get some feedback. And they said, sure, we can do that. So they did, and about 2 weeks later, they sent it back, and they said, we love it. And they had some massive changes because they wanted it for a broader audience. I'd written it for a more specific religious audience. It was a non-fiction book and a kind of a guide. And they said, but we think the general audience would love this. It's great advice. We'll give you 10 days to rewrite the entire thing. And they gave me 500 different things to do. They said, can you do it? And I said, sure. You know, that's what you always say when you're given an opportunity. You say, sure. And so 24/7 for 10 days, I was working on this, got it done, sent it back to them. And they sent it back. And they said, we love it. And so they published it. And it was modestly successful, given that I didn't have any idea that once you publish a book, that's only the beginning. There's a lot of distribution and marketing and the kind of things we're doing right now that I'm pretty used to now. But that was back in 2010. And then one thing led to another, and here I am now. It's a little bit stunning still to walk into a bookstore, and I'll see one of my books on the shelf, and I'll walk up and I'll open up the book, and I'll say, wow, this is really cool. I wish I could do something like this. Then I look at, I say, hey, well, wait a minute, I did.
So
it's hard to relate to.
What was the motivation? Was it something that you've always wanted to do? As you said, you looked at your bucket list and there it was. Is it something you always wanted to do, or is it something that just because you were in between CFO jobs, you decided, I might as well try this out?
Well, sometimes things happen because you've come to a point in life where there is a choice. You've got a fork in the road, as Robert Frost say, and you can't choose to stand there. You've got to go forward, and you don't know what to do. And so my wife and I have a blended family. We have 10 children, and they were all getting to the age where they were in their 20s. And I had spent years real actively mountain biking, and I still do. And as I rode, I thought about these examples of, well, gee, if you make these choices, you'll have a better experience, or you'll avoid falling, or you'll avoid difficulties, like drinking sufficient water and staying hydrated, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And so what I started getting when my kids got into their 20s was calls from various children. Usually it happened late at night. And they are just starting to realize that maybe the biggest challenge in life isn't that they didn't get invited to the prom, or maybe they didn't make the team, right? Those are real crises when you're a teenager. But when you get a little older, they're not even on the list anymore. And they're starting to face things like, gee, I lost my job. My wife and I are struggling a little bit, or we just had a child and I don't know what to do, and all sorts of the real issues in life. And so what I did is I wrote a series of 15 parables for them based on mountain biking that I had kind of collected over the years, and for just that age, 20 and 30 somethings. And they turned out to be just what the doctor ordered from these kids. So I wrote them about, let's say, a principle like avoiding obstacles, which is basically saying don't focus on the negative, right?
Right.
And then I have a later chapter that says sometimes you have to hit the rock anyway. So what do you do if you can't avoid the obstacle? Those are 2 chapters in the book. And they're non-denominational, but they are parables that relate an activity of mountain biking to a principle of maintaining spiritual equilibrium when you start running into the real problems of life. And it was pretty popular. It's been popular among young adults and 20 and 30 somethings. And once you kind of get the bug, you start seeing the world in a different way. You really do.
Well,
so that's what happened.
What was the message for Giants in the Land? And
Oh, that's
and
yeah.
obviously you talked about that when I was there at the meeting,
Hmm.
and it was all adults. It wasn't teenagers. It was
Right.
all adults, and yet the principles that you were talking about were certainly applicable. But what motivated you, and what is the whole message really of Giants in the Land?
Hmm. Well, there's first of all, there's never an age when you can say, I crossed the goal line, I'm done. I'm going to spike the ball and sit and watch everybody else and play the game now, right? You
Right.
never get to that point where you can just withdraw and stop growing. And the older you get, the more important it is to have some kind of role that you're playing that makes a difference and that keeps you motivated and involved, just kind of like what you're doing with these programs. I think it's awesome. But back in the 90s, when I was an investment banker, there was a huge a problem that occurred in Utah. We had built our economy on a couple of very large companies. Novell was one. WordPerfect was another. You're probably familiar with
Oh
those.
yes.
They were huge employers, huge influencers, brilliant management, and really real goers and getters. And they were all located down in south of the Salt Lake area in Utah County. And within a very short period of time, both of these companies, one way or another, just kind of disappeared. They
Oh
were
yeah.
acquired, or they got leapt over by companies that had more resources, but maybe not as good at technology. And people were just stunned. They were despondent. And a good friend of mine, Brad Bertosh, was involved in one of the community organizations locally, and had a bunch of business people in a setting. And he talked about that sometimes we grow up and we have these giants among us and we become too dependent on them. And there comes a time in everybody's life, whether that giant is a company or a grandparent or a parent or a teacher or whoever it might be, a coach, that giant moves on or passes on. And you have to have learned enough to be able to carry on and become a giant yourself. It was a very inspirational talk. He just referenced it briefly. Over the years, I see more deeply into that whole concept now. So when I explain it in more depth than he did, because he was just moving on to tell people that there'll be other things coming along. Don't worry.
Right.
And so I sat there and I realized there is a book here. There's a story here. And so over the next year or two, as I had time, I wrote a short story. It was about 30 pages long. And after I'd had some success with my first book, and then I did a Christmas book, which has been very successful, I took this story to my publisher. And they said, this is a great start, but we don't do short stories. Can you make this into a book? And so I said, well, let me think, maybe. And it ends up being 3 books and a whole trilogy. And there's more of those in me, more Giants in the Land books in me, but I've moved on to a couple of other things. Maybe I'll come back.
So, principle-wise, what were the principles that you were trying to teach in the book? Because I know you
Yeah.
had a number of them.
Well, let me just give you a 30-second preview of the book, and then
Okay.
I'll go on to the principle.
Great.
The book, think agricultural medieval. That's the setting for this. There is a town, a village, where there are regular-sized people living side by side with giants. And the giants are large. They're 23 to 26 feet tall. But these giants aren't the big, ugly, monstrous, man-eating, stupid things that we see throughout literature. They're just really big people. And they do the things that we have heavy machinery for nowadays. I don't have a backhoe or a crane. I've got a giant. The people work hard too, but they have become much more dependent on these giants than they realize. They never go out in the wild world without a giant by their side, for example. They've always got a solution to a problem that's bigger or more threatening than they can deal with. So they've got an easy out,
Yeah.
kind of like Harry Potter with the wand, right?
Right.
And suddenly one morning they wake up, they work hard too, the regular sized people, and they go out to their fields and their work, and the giants have disappeared without a trace. And so this is an analogy to our real lives. We all have giants in our lives, people who make a huge difference. And as I said before, they all pass on or move on, and we have to recognize while we have them with us that there's something special about them we can learn from and try to grow so that we can take those next giant steps, because you know for sure there are others that are looking to us that follow as well. And so the story carries on with hysteria in the local community. They don't know what to do. Nobody's willing to go out to look for these giants because they've never been out in the wild world before. And we have one farmer, he's not an adventurer or a hunter, he has no skills, who goes out, who says, well, somebody has to do it, so he has to go out by himself. And this is a coming of age story. It's been compared to A Pilgrim's Progress, for example. You see these kinds of characters in all sorts of movies. This was Luke Skywalker, for example, in the Star Wars series, someone who had no idea what they were getting into, but took the leap anyway. And of course, this individual finds the giants eventually, and I'm not going to tell you how that happens. There's lots of danger and adventure along the way. But he also discovers himself and realizes his own destiny and learns that his destiny is tied into the giants, that there's been a purpose for all of this. He learns about the great purpose and secrets that they protect, why they do what they do, what their reason for being is, and so on and so forth. That's book one. And it sets the stage for books 2 and book 3 when they're dealing with a threat that comes into the land. The giants live by a code. They can't just impose their will because they're big and strong. And so they cannot use force to get what they want. They have this code they live by. Mm-hmm. So anyway, as this threat comes into the land in the later books, they have to deal with it. And because they don't have special powers, they can't say, beam me up, Scotty, or use a wand or use a superpower. They have to reach inside themselves and find their own greatness and become something more than they otherwise would have been. And this journey we take with these characters helps us look inside ourselves and discover what I call learning to live with the heart of a giant. And that's what we talked about in our meeting you attended the other day.
Yes.
That's where this book takes people, especially youth, but any age can appreciate the concept that we can find things that we already have that we don't realize we have within us, capabilities, courage, ability to do hard things and solve difficult problems, even if they're outside our realm of education or experience. And that's what these characters learn, and they have some very extraordinary experiences that they have to rise to because there's nobody else to do it for them. And so it's been a powerful influence on young people, and I'll get the parents and grandparents that sneak them off their kids' nightstands, and I just tell them, make sure you get it back to them before they get back to school so you don't get caught.
Well, you said something interesting that struck me, and I want to go there a little bit, because you talked about how this particular individual in your book went out to look for giants, and in that process started to grow. And I'm not sure you meant what you said there, but basically he became a giant in a sense. Mm-hmm. And I look at that and I think about in general with humanity and what we go through, how many times are there people out there that are really looking for a giant in their lives to protect them, to help them, to be a guide. And as they find someone who's actually being willing to do that, and as you said, those giants have a very strict code of honor, that as that occurs, ultimately those people that have been helped by the giants get to the point where they in turn begin to help someone else because they become
Right.
someone else's giant.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And you may not be able to accomplish whatever task it is the same way as you observe someone else do it, because you might not have the same set of skills. You might not be as strong, or maybe you're better at pulling people together and getting it done together. But you're sneaking ahead in the book and giving away some of the secrets here. But those are some of the realizations that Thomas has in this book. And I will tell you that there's a point in the book where he's having a conversation with a particular giant who's more or less they don't have a king or anything, but because they live in kind of a collective society. But he is their wise man or their shaman. Okay, and Thomas is saying, well, why can't you come back and help us solve these problems? Just you guys have always been the solution to our problems. And this giant just turns to him and says, you have to become the solution to your own problems. And that's one of the keys of learning how to live like with the heart of a giant. You recognize that you do have the power. You are enough to do this. And that's a real eye-opener for him. He realizes it's never going to be the same again. And I lost both my parents. And this young man in the book has lost his father recently, and he's struggling with that. And when we go along in life, and nothing changes from day to day. And then one day we wake up, and there's been some event that's occurred, and we suddenly realize that things will never be the same again. But that's okay. That's okay. We can still move forward.
And you it's interesting you say that. I was at a meeting yesterday, and you may or may not have heard this, but we had some local families, 3 young ladies in high school, get into a horrible accident. A truck actually lost control and hit them right in the front, and put a couple of them, one particularly, in the hospital, and the other 2 finally got out of it. But the comment was made, we never know when our journey suddenly will change.
Right.
Because obviously for these young ladies, their journeys are going to change. And I thought that was a profound comment that affects all of us and really applies to all of us, because you never know, as you're going along in life, suddenly something occurs and the journey and the path that you thought you were on suddenly changes. And now you have to adapt to a new journey, to a new path, with different obstacles and barriers that you have to face. Now, you talked, was it 7 areas that you talked about when I was hearing you talk in your keynote about
Right.
different areas?
And depending on how much time I have more or less. I usually send groups a list of 15 alternative subjects that I can talk on, and they'll pick 4 or 5.
Okay,
and then
well,
I'll pick a couple.
We don't have that
Yeah.
much time, but we got
Yeah.
a little bit of time. So, I'd love for you to just kind of go through some of those. I know one of the things you talked about is being able to accept. And I think I get to the thought process of taking responsibility for your situation. And I think that's hard, because there's so many times when things happen to people, the easy way out is to blame someone else. And they end up with that victimology type of attitude that it isn't my fault, it's their fault. And as long as
Right.
they do that, they find that they're constantly victims. Whereas if they finally ultimately take responsibility for whatever circumstances have happened, all of a sudden it changes their ability to go down a different path in a positive way. So I'd love for you to just, start out with some of those, and we'll go as long as we can. But what are some of those issues, and what are some of those specific ideas that you shared that I thought was so powerful?
Well, let me just briefly touch on what you just mentioned. I think one of the greatest challenges in life today, in our society today, is we have a society that has forgotten how to take responsibility, and we're not teaching our children to do that. Sometimes that means you fail. Sometimes you need to admit to something really embarrassing that you did. Yeah, I did bully that kid, right? And I'm really sorry, and I'm going to try not to do it again. And sometimes you have to take consequences for those things. But the alternative, and that's tough, but you grow through that process. And that is the key process, I think, that makes a child become a man or a woman, right? It is that process of refining in recognizing that you have the power. You can enable yourself to accomplish things, but that also means you are enabling yourself to take some of the consequences when you make mistakes. And even when you think it's somebody else's fault, you can learn from your contribution to the process. And if you don't do that, then you do become a victim, walking around, waiting patiently, hopelessly for that next comet to hit because you don't have control over your own life. And that's something that runs through all of my series. There's a very strong strain of these kids and adults having to recognize that the only way out is through. You can't just hyperspace to a different point and miss it. And one of the things I talked about with your group was the concept of monsters and heroes. And we had a picture there of the old Jason and the Argonauts fighting the skeletons and Spider-Man, and also surrounded by all his villains. And one of the great enablers in recognizing you can make progress is that you begin to realize that the villains, the monsters, or the threats in your life, right? The things that they may be internal. You may have challenges with depression or feel anxiety. You may feel unequal to a task that you're assigned to, or just feel like you don't deserve to be around the people you're around because they're way too good and you don't measure up. On the other hand, sometimes these things are real monsters from outside. They're external threats. I might lose my job. There's a person at work who has it in for me and is going to try to get me fired. Or, there's endless possibilities. Kids at school worry about failing classes. I had one young lady come to me who she was worried about passing a test, and she had difficulties with depression. And I said, well, what's your worry? It's just a test. And she said, if I don't pass this test, I won't pass this class. Therefore, I won't graduate high school. Therefore, I won't be able to go to college and get an education. And then I don't feel anybody will want to marry me, and I'll never be a mother. Oh, wow. And I said, what? You mean you're putting all of that weight on passing this test? Just learn the stuff and pass the test. It's not the end of the world. It's not going to have any impact on whether you can be a good mother. I mean, really. But people do that to themselves. And so what I try to do is I try to flip that on its head and help people recognize that Spider-Man could not be Spider-Man if he just dressed up in tights and slung his web around, but had no villains to contend with. He had no challenges. Spider-Man had internal challenges. His parent, he was a foster child living with his uncle and aunt. He'd lost his parents, so he had lots of things to deal with. But what you realize in any kind of literature or movies is that heroes don't exist without villains. Yes. They don't exist independently. You have to have a villain or a monster or some kind of obstacle or challenge to face and overcome, or you're not a hero. Otherwise, there's no such thing. So these villains are part of your life story, and they're not a threat to you achieving what you want to achieve, they are actually the conduit, the vehicle by which you achieve it, because that's how you discover your greatness. Now, I'm not suggesting an Eastern religion approach, which the more terrible our life is, the better insect we come back as, okay?
No, well, and I think about football games, and think about. In fact, I've said this a couple of times. How boring would it be to watch a football game if there was no opposition?
Right. It'd just be a set practice, right?
You run, you throw, whatever. No one's stopping you. That would be boring. But when when you watch the Super Bowl and the competition and the obstacles and the opposition, I mean that became so exciting in respects, and then you look at your own life, and when you start to feel that opposition, all of a sudden that excitement goes away, when in fact you should be grateful and excited that you're experiencing the opposition, because now you can prove that you can be the hero. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of helping you be the hero. There's no Super Bowl champion unless there's a Super Bowl loser. And maybe next year that one that lost learns something and becomes a champion. They grow from it.
Right.
But there are no small stages. And that's important to remember. One thing that we often do to ourselves is say, nobody understands my problem. It's different and unique. And everybody's got these big things, and mine are little. But even though I can't deal with them, nobody cares. And that's not true. There are no small stages. Every person has a story. And that story is what has helped that person become the great person that they are. The good and the bad, the mistakes and the right choices, the things that embarrassed them, and the things they're really proud of, all come together in a big blending process that has made you, Doug, the great person you are, and anybody else. Everybody has a story. So that's just one of the points that we talk about.
So you've got responsibility, being willing to take personal responsibility. You've got being recognizing that life is going to be full of villains, and that's important, because otherwise you can't become a hero. What were some of the other things that you think were pertinent?
Well, you'll recall this. One of the things that always is fun to talk about is the roller coasters. You remember that part of it?
Yes.
Yeah, and we show some pictures of different experiences people have on roller coasters, and I've got some pictures of some really phenomenal roller coasters. I mean, in our day and age, my parents and grandparents couldn't even imagine the kind of amazing roller coasters that you can ride now. I don't ride any of them because I'll just get sick. But
neither do I.
My wife loves them, and my kids love them, and I stand on the ground and take pictures. But there's a message there that we talk about. I mean, I'm not a young buck anymore, although I feel that way inside. Outside, my costume I'm wearing is a little bit older than I envision it. But I have a lot of friends that have spent decades riding roller coasters to nowhere, because a roller coaster is fun. It's got thrills, it's got spills, it's got adventure for a few seconds. And then it takes you back right where you started from. You don't actually go anywhere. And the point I make in this with young people and all kinds of groups is that when you're going to spend years pursuing something, make sure that when you get to the end of the process that it's worth being there when you get there. And that you haven't just been going around in circles and wasting your time. And we don't need to talk about drug addiction or crime or any of those kinds of things to see people on roller coasters. We can see people recklessly pursuing things that don't matter because it's something that they selfishly just want to achieve. Right? I want to get this award, or I want to climb this mountain. And they forget that the things that make a difference and really make you happy involve other people and helping them become more too. That's one of the secrets of being a giant. You recognize it's not about you. It's about helping others to become giants, because you can't stop it. There are always people watching you, thinking maybe I should follow that individual.
Well, and I think you're so right because you've observed, I've observed so many times where people just try this and try that and they end up in the same place. Now, on the other hand, once in a while, it's fun to ride a roller coaster.
No
But as
question.
long as you recognize that it's an adventure that is just strictly that, it's an
Yep.
adventure to have some fun. Now we're back on the earth. Now it's time to step forward and move forward and start to see a goal in the
Hmm.
future that I can actually achieve. Just like what you did. I mean, to me, I think it's amazing that here you were working in the corporate world, and all of a sudden I get the feeling you're having a blast writing these books.
Yeah, this is the most fun I've ever had. And the last comment I've made on roller coasters is I totally agree. You have to recognize what a roller coaster is, but it's okay sometimes. When I ride a roller coaster or when I do something like that, my choice is I want to do it with somebody. It's always more fun to share an experience with somebody that means something to you. And that could be a child or a grandchild or a spouse or a friend. It doesn't matter. But when you're sharing it with somebody, it makes it so much richer and so much more meaningful because you can talk about it. You might learn something and be able to share it in the process. So if you're going to ride a roller coaster, or better yet, if you're going to go on an adventure that actually takes you somewhere, do it with somebody. It'll enrich your life.
Oh, absolutely. All right, so we've got enough time for one more point.
Okay.
What would be the one point beyond the ones that we've already talked about that you think is a vital point for folks to understand as they're seeking to experience a better life?
Well, I'd say believe in yourself. Recognize that you have skills and that you have a God that cares about you and that has put you here for a reason. And that as you seek out what that reason is and pursue whatever it is that you feel that you can contribute to others around you, it all starts with trying to maintain that confidence that you are somebody that has a purpose. And I think society sometimes tries to rob us of that self-esteem. And that's what produces hopelessness and makes us become a victim, is when we forget that we have value. And go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and oftentimes, we think about experiences we have as children and overcoming obstacles and moving forward. And sometimes we experience, unfortunately, either from our parents or from our teachers or whatever, where they in turn just tell us you're never going to succeed, you're bad, you're this,
Right.
you're that, and all of a sudden we develop this concept within ourselves that we can't do it, that we're not good enough. And the question is, how on earth does an individual overcome, at least in your opinion, that sense that I'm not good enough and come to the realization that, in fact, yes, you are. And as you say, you're one of God's children. You are good. You are powerful. It's just a matter of understanding that and then being willing to recognize where your strengths and talents are in order to be able to then share those with others.
Well, I think part of it is recognizing that there is a partnership, a heavenly partnership with you, and that you're never alone. You are never alone. Because we all will have those moments in our lives. And that's one reason my original book was written, because kids start running into those and they can't deal with them. We'll have those moments in our lives where we have to decide if we are worth fighting for. Am I, Clark Burbidge, worthy, valuable enough for me, Clark Burbidge, to fight for him? We have to make that decision. If we're not willing to fight for ourselves, nobody else will. Okay? We'll still have a partner, but we're not going to look to him because we're not interested. So the story that I used was my first day at college. I walk into an English class, and I'm a college student now. I'm feeling pretty good about myself. I'm on the swimming team. I've worked out that morning. I'm feeling like kind of Studley, and I go in the class. There's about 25, 30 other students in the class. The teacher doesn't even say hello. He doesn't write his name on the board like we got in high school. And he just says, write a paragraph on tying your shoes. And then doesn't say anything else. It's like, what? Take out a piece of paper and a pencil, write a paragraph on tying your shoes. Or I'm going to grade them right now. And I thought, well, this is ridiculous. I'm a college student. I know how to do that. Why are you asking me? Well, it was a little test. And so we did it. We spent 15 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever it was and handed him in. And then the real test began. He started calling us up alphabetically. He graded them while we sat there. Remember, college is like an hour and a half class.
Oh, yeah.
So you have time to torture people if you really want to, okay? Or you can raise them up if you want to. He chose torture. And he called us up one at a time and said what grade we were going to get in the whole semester and whether or not he thought we should drop to class. And it was stunning. It was shattering for some of the kids. I mean, there were kids that ran out crying and never came back. He called me up. He said, Burbidge. I said, yeah, that's me. Come on up to the front. And without even a hesitation, he said, you're going to get a D in the class. You probably should drop. And I looked at him. I couldn't believe what I heard. It's my first day, my first class. This is how college is going to be? Really? And so I had to make a decision. It was one of those moments. It's not the same as something that's life and death, but for me and for college, it was a tipping point. And so I decided I was going to stay in the class. It would have been easy to just drop and tell everybody, don't ever take that class again. But I never did. And I didn't get an A, I got a B. But then I'll ask the crowd, I'll say, who did I show that I could do that? And people will say, well, you showed the teacher. And yeah, maybe. But who I really showed that I could do it was me. I could do things. Even when somebody didn't believe in me, I put myself in a position where I had to believe in myself. Oh, and by the way, I probably worked harder. Was it a good strategy for the teacher to use? No, I think it was a horrible strategy. Has that experience made me a better person? Yeah, I wish he'd read one of my books now. I think he might give me better than a D.
Well, and it's interesting how you're right. I mean, and at least if we get to the point where we have the ability to really understand what's happening and recognize that, hey, here's a teacher that is just basically a jerk, and I'm not going to let him define my life. And therefore, you did what you had to do to prove to yourself that wasn't a correct statement. And I look at those that are perhaps a little bit younger and recognize that sometimes they don't have that sophistication of maturity yet to be able to understand that what that individual just said was them, had nothing to do with you.
Right.
And yet, even with that, if you can have enough belief system in yourself to say, no, I can do this, even as a young person that doesn't have that mental maturity yet, they can work through that.
Well, and the truth of the story is probably my paragraph I turned in was a D paragraph. Yeah. That's probably how bad it was. I didn't care. It didn't mean anything to me. But when I decided I was going to take that responsibility and go somewhere different than he thought I was going to go, then I had to work. I had to turn myself into a B writer. And so that made a difference. But yeah, we can take some responsibility. I'm not going to sit back and say, oh, it was all his fault. It was a terrible circumstance. No, he was probably telling me the truth. He did it in a horrible way, but he was probably telling me the truth. Okay, so don't fall to pieces. Pick yourself up on the ground and prove that you can do better work than that. That's the challenge. That's what you do if you believe in yourself. If you have the heart of a giant, that's what you do.
Well, and hence the book, Giants in the Land.
Right. Exactly right. We've
And
circled back.
yes, and what I love is, find the giants in your life because they're there,
Hmm.
and then become the giant to others.
Right. Well, you should get the books and read them. I think that
Okay, I'm going to.
there are different levels at which you can read this book. You can certainly read for the roller coaster ride and the adventure. But when you really appreciate a book, you find yourself in the book with the characters, walking the trail with them. And as soon as that starts happening, you're now having an experience. You're not reading anymore. And you can understand motivations and characters and what's going on in their lives and relate to that. And then you can put it into your life. And that's what these books allow you to do. That's how I write. You can read in layers. And any 5-year-old will love this book if their mom or dad sits down with them and reads it together. But a 65-year-old will love this book, and they'll shed a few tears because they'll see themselves walking in Thomas's shoes, trying to struggle with the challenges that they can relate all too easily to.
Well, and my admiration goes out to you
Yeah.
for taking the step to go from, and I'm sure you were contributing well as a CFO, but I have a hunch that you're contributing to a lot more lives through the messages of your books, and you're willing to do that.
Well, it's a lot more satisfying and a lot more fun.
Yeah.
It's the most fun I've ever had.
Well, and there's a point, folks. You know what? If you can make a good living and have fun at the same time, if you
Yep.
find a purpose and really follow through with it. Well, Clark, thanks for being on the show. I
Okay.
really appreciate it.
Can I just take a second and tell them where they can find my books?
I
Is
was
that
going to ask you that, so please do
all
now.
right?
Yeah,
I know you're the pro. I'm sorry to.
that's all right.
jump in.
No, go ahead.
So my books can be found at the bookstores. One of the challenges is that, Deseret or Barnes or any of those kinds of things, they'll only order in a couple and then they're gone immediately because they're popular books. So you can go online to Amazon or Barnes and Noble or IndieBound, and if you go to one of my websites first, one is starpassagebook.com. That's easy to remember, or giantsinthelandbook.com. And you click through, it'll take you right to those book sites, and it'll take you to my authors page, so you can see all my books on the same page. You don't have to navigate for each one, and then you can choose. And can I just show you a picture of our most current one?
Absolutely. And the folks that are listening to this in audio, you're not going to be able to see it, but for those of you that are watching the video, yes, please.
I'll describe it. There's a
Okay.
reason that if I can get it on the right spot on this.
Put it right underneath your chin.
Okay. Oh,
There
yeah,
you
there
go.
you go. There we go, right here. So this is, my wife and I wrote this together. It's called Living in the Family Blender. It came out this last year. It is a Gold Medal Award winner also. It gives you 10 principles of a successful blended family. And because we are 15 years into our blended family of 10 children, we think that maybe we learned a little something in that process, so we thought we'd pass it forward. It is written for really 3 groups of people. First of all, of course, anybody who's in a blended family right now.
Uh-huh.
But secondly, anybody who counsels or teaches or interacts with kids or adults in a blended family would learn a lot by appreciating this. And third, anybody who's single and may at some point in the future contemplate becoming involved in a relationship again, that may well be a blended relationship. And it's also true with people getting married for the first time, because you're blending in every one of those circumstances. It's just a matter of degrees. And when you bring children to the picture, then all of the issues are similar, but they're closer to the surface.
Yes.
And so that's been a really fun experience for us, and we feel like people who are finding this book or loving it as well.
Okay, so repeat the two websites one more time. So, folks, you can go
Okay.
to these websites or you can go to Amazon.
Right. And once you get to either one of these websites, you can click through and it'll just bring you right to my author's page. The websites are starpassagebook.com and giantsinthelandbook.com.
Great. And Clark, thank you once again. You're one of the reasons why I started and rebranded this show the way I did, is to find people who are making a difference in other people's lives. And so kudos to you. I appreciate that. I appreciate the fact you're willing to be on this show. Folks, thanks so much for joining us. Get a hold of those books. I'm going to get Giants in the Land and read them and hopefully learn some things, which I think I will. And so,
Well, you call me when you get one, and I'll come over and sign it for you.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So thanks so much. And folks, we look forward to having you join us next time. And meanwhile, have a wonderful week. And Clark, thanks again.
Thank you.